From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The U.S. House of Representatives passes the debt ceiling bill negotiated by Kevin McCarthy, Speaker of the House, and President Joe Biden with an overwhelming vote, 314 to 117. It's a major victory for Speaker McCarthy, despite losing 71 Republicans, but he did get 149 Republicans to vote for it, something they never do, voting for a debt ceiling increase, while the Democrats voted 165 to 46 in favor. The Senate is next, where it is expected to pass after the House vote on Thursday or Friday. We'll break down the impact of the bill and what it means going forward. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal opinion pages here on Potomac Watch with Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson, my colleagues. Let's listen to Kevin McCarthy talk about the bill.
I wanted to do something no other Congress has done, that we would literally turn the ship, that for the first time in quite some time, we'd spend less than we spent the year before. Tonight, we all made history, because this is the biggest cut and savings this Congress has ever voted for. And it's not that we're just voting for it. This is going to be law.
Well, okay, politicians go for hyperbole often, and the biggest, the best, the baddest, what have you. But it is a victory in the sense, I mean, certainly in political terms, McCarthy could not afford to fail, and he didn't. He got the bulk of his 2-to-1 in the caucus, more than 2-to-1, which a lot of people wondered if he could get. Policy victory, it's not earth-shaking in the sense that it doesn't solve all of our fiscal problems. The entitlements were even off the table. But focusing on domestic discretionary spending. This reduces the budget authority for that spending by $112 billion for fiscal 24 and more than $130 billion again in 2025. Extend that over a decade. It cuts baseline spending to $1.5 trillion, though that's really too far to predict in the future because events will happen and change that expectation. But I think, Kim, it's a significant vote, particularly and significant achievement politically when you think that he only had a 4-vote majority in the House. Republicans don't have the Senate, don't have the White House. He used his leverage pretty well, in my humble opinion.
I join you in that humble opinion. Look, the victory here was that up until a month ago, the White House and Senate leader Chuck Schumer had said, you have to pass a clean debt limit and you're going to get nothing for it. And his real victory, or the setting for this, was getting his caucus, even though it's very slim, to unite around that Limit, Save, Grow bill and finally have some negotiating leverage, which he then used, I think, fairly skillfully. It is not earth-shattering, but I like to think of it in terms of directional, meaning if it was up to Democrats, we wouldn't be cutting any money at the moment. We'd be growing it substantially. And they felt that that was going to be their hand, given that they have the White House and the Senate. And instead, we are going the opposite direction, albeit in a modest manner. And yes, in terms of the votes, he got 2/3 of his members, 67% of them, to vote for a debt ceiling increase, something that many Republicans have in the past refused to do on principle. You are now seeing some weird press coverage suggesting that this was a blow to him because there were more Democrats that backed it than Republicans. I've never heard that as the measure before. I remember only a few weeks ago the endless stories about what was going to happen to McCarthy if he couldn't even get a majority of his own members to vote for this and have to be rescued by Democrats. That was far from the case. And so I think in some ways it's worth even, looking and reevaluating his speakership in light of this and how he pulled this off, because I still remember the Boehner and Ryan days, and in past, the Republican conservative bloc has managed to derail a lot of things. That didn't happen in this case, and it seems like we're a long ways from those 6 months ago when people wondered if he was going to be able to even hang on for a month.
Let's dig into that a little bit, but first let's listen to Chip Roy, who's the congressman from Texas, member of the Freedom Caucus, on the Rules Committee and voted against proceeding with the rule to move this to the floor, but it got through the Rules Committee on a 7-6 vote. But let's listen to him talk about this deal.
I don't hear a whole hell of a lot about what we're doing to devastate American families with rampant inflation because we keep spending money we don't have. To my colleagues on this side of the aisle, my beef isn't that I don't understand the struggle with the negotiators against that kind of reasoning. My beef is that you cut a deal that shouldn't have been cut.
Kyle, a deal had to be cut. Eventually, he had to raise the debt ceiling. What do you make of Chip Roy's case?
I understand some of the arguments he's making. I listened to more of that speech. He was complaining, for example, that this is only about a 2-year spending freeze, that it doesn't get rid of 100% of the IRS extra funding, that it punts the President Biden student loan forgiveness plan to the Supreme Court instead of dealing with it legislatively and making clear that the president lacks that authority, that it signs on to the post-COVID size of government. I understand those complaints, but some of them strike me as not grappling with the reality of divided government. Republicans only hold one chamber of Congress and not the White House, and they only hold that chamber of Congress by 4 votes. And so this is a historically narrow majority, and you're going to have to make a deal, as you said. Some of this stuff strikes me as things that the president was really unlikely to sign. I mean, the student loan forgiveness plan is one of his signature policies. He has backed this IRS expansion plan, and it strikes me a little bit like tilting at windmills, which Republicans have a long history of doing. One example that always comes to mind is Ted Cruz's famous push to defund Obamacare, as if only Republicans could stick together and quit folding under the establishment GOP, that President Obama would somehow defund Obamacare. It's really implausible. And to your other point, I think that you have to think about what the alternatives here are. If the McCarthy plan did not pass the House, what does Chip Roy think would happen? It seems that most likely, to me, is that we get closer and closer to that default X date, and Republican moderates in the House and the Senate start feeling that pressure, worrying about a credit downgrade, and then they decide to give President Biden what he wanted, which is a bill that just raises the debt ceiling without doing any of this other stuff that are Republican priorities.
I mean, on the student loan forgiveness point, I mean, you're in a negotiation with the president. You want certain things. He's opposed to certain things. You got to pick and choose. You're not getting everything you want. And if I had been McCarthy, I would have given on the student loan forgiveness too. Why? Because if the Supreme Court is poised to call his forgiveness unconstitutional, which I believe it is. Of course, I could be wrong, but if they do, in fact, find it unconstitutional, you don't need to pass it because it's going to be eliminated anyway. So go for other victories. That's my point there. Now, I think Chip Roy has a lot of good points about some of the other things. We opposed the $80 billion for the IRS, but they did, Kim, and you've dug into this, get $1.8 billion for hiring new IRS enforcement agents in the next fiscal year, which, of course, is the one that really matters.
Right, because what it does is it puts the IRS agenda of ramping up its enforcement on hold. That is the immediate prerogative, to stop what was supposed to be a 5, 6, 7-year plan to supersize and turbocharge IRS agents who are going to go after and harass people. And so that's not happening at the moment because of this deal. And Republicans will tell you, look, we're not done here yet. We can also tackle this when we do our appropriations bills later this year. We can come back in next year. It might not be on a debt ceiling vote because that has now been punted to beyond the presidential election. But there are going to be other must-pass scenarios for certain pieces of legislation, government funding bills, where Republicans can come back and try to get their policy preferences and try to cut some more of that IRS funding out.
Yeah, and they did get some other victories. Mount Valley Pipeline is going to be now all but done. That had been held up for years. That'll very much help energy supplies in the American Southeast. You got a 1% sequester on the government spending if Congress doesn't pass the 12 appropriations bills this coming budget year. That's significant, Kyle, because the Senate, which the Democrats control, doesn't want to pass a budget, doesn't want to sign individual appropriations bills. They want to pack everything into one giant omnibus bill, as they usually do, because that's when they can really smoke the GOP. You have to pass individual appropriations bills. You can do some policy victories in there, and you can maybe make some more progress on work for welfare rules. Maybe you can put some policy riders on. Now, you're not going to get everything you want. The president still has the veto pen, but Biden can't veto everything either.
That's the other piece of this that I think some of these critics are missing, is I don't think McCarthy sees this as, this is what we've accomplished this Congress. Now I can go back home to California and not be negotiating over other pieces of legislation. I don't think that's the approach at all. I think that the mentality is, here's a point of leverage we have on the debt ceiling. Let's get what we can. And then we come back when we get into the appropriations process, when we get into the farm bill, when we get another supplementary aid to Ukraine bill. And there can be Republican victories in those pieces of legislation as well. And that's how you make progress, I think, especially in divided government, is a little bit here, a little bit there. And then suddenly policy looks completely different than it did when you took the House in the 2022 elections.